Good afternoon, everyone. We're actually going to start 2 minutes early because the room is packed and one of our panelists had to leave some halfway through the event to catch a flight. So we'll just get started. If those are in the back, if you want to walk down the sides and stand here, you can. It might be better than being all crowded there by the door. So please do feel free to make your way down. So welcome to this side event, which is called Paving the Way for the Future, Uncovering and Addressing the Blind Spots in UN Drug Policy. My name's Anne Fordham. I'm the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium, and I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors, the governments of Canada, Colombia, Czechia, Germany, Mexico, Norway, Portugal, and Switzerland, and our UN agency co-sponsors, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNAIDS, and UNDP. So we will focus this discussion today on some of the key blind spots identified in IDPC's Shadow Report, which we launched here in December, and options for reform between now and the final review of the 2019 Ministerial Declaration in 2029. Our Shadow Report evaluates the progress made in achieving the goals and 12 challenges included in the 2019 Ministerial Declaration on Drugs. And as a contribution to the 2024 midterm review, so it was also a contribution to the 2024 midterm review. And in our analysis, we identified a number of blind spots, that is, topics that have not been considered a priority at the time of the 2019 Ministerial Declaration, or that have arose as key issues of concern since that declaration was adopted. And these include, among others, the lack of UN guidance on the human rights implications of the increased use of new technologies, on responsible legal regulation, on the environmental impacts of drug policy, on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and the need to place racial justice at the center of drug policy. Our report also reveals a very sobering picture in general, with increasing drug-related deaths, while access to gender-sensitive and age-appropriate harm reduction and treatment falls dramatically short of need. Access to controlled medicines for the relief of pain and palliative care also remains low to non-existent in most parts of the world. And our report highlighted that in all regions, the human rights impacts of drug control have either worsened or remained unchanged. And these abuses are widespread and include the ongoing use of the death penalty, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrest and detention, mass incarceration, and cases of torture masquerading as treatment. And there is also widespread discrimination on the basis of race, gender, age, and socioeconomic status. So in this side event, and as an important follow-up from the midterm review, our panel will propose recommendations on how to give prominence to and address the blind spots, in particular as a matter of urgency, with the objective of better aligning global drug policy with human rights and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Raphael Nägeli, the permanent representative of Switzerland to the UN here at Vienna. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Welcome to this important side event, which addresses blind spots on the UN drug policy. The IDPC has launched its Shadow Report in last December. It has identified important challenges, as we have just heard before by many thanks. We learned from this report that drug markets are not only expanding, but also diversifying. New technologies are becoming increasingly important. The illegal drug market also continues to lead to violence, to human rights violations, and to conflict. Unfortunately, violence and human rights violations are also found in criminal prosecutions. We are witnessing an increase in prison sentences for drug offenses, as well as in treatment. Many countries also are imposing criminal and other sanctions for people in distress. But not only human rights are under threat, also people's health, a topic that is especially important. The report notes the increase of overdose-related death, as well as a rise in blood-borne diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. At the same time, the possibility and access to harm reduction remains limited, non-existent in many countries. And here in Vienna, the issue of harm reduction is a complex problem. Switzerland knows these developments, the global and the actual developments from its own past. In the 1990s, Switzerland experienced a severe drug crisis, which has led to a paradigm shift. Back then, the government decided to put people's health at the center of our drug policy. Switzerland has implemented a national four-field strategy that is based on human rights and focuses on reducing health-related and social harms. The four pillars are prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and repression. This strategy has yielded significant results. As for today, the number of fatalities and infections have constantly fixed. Our strategy also relies on a partnership approach, where health and law enforcement authorities work hand in hand with civil society organizations to provide services to people who use drugs and communities affected and to the general population. Switzerland's federal organization makes us deeply aware of the importance of our partners from civil society to inform us of the needs of the general population and to help us providing services to respond to these specific needs. That's why the shadow reports and today's side event are so important. They contribute to our debates and deliberations. We're therefore all the more pleased that this report is based on a survey of communities in different parts of the world, bringing us the views of those who work daily to address these issues related to drug control. We can provide health and social services to people who are most in need, or deliver prevention, treatment, and harm reduction services. We welcome the recommendations made by this report as an important contribution that helps us shaping our thinking, and we thank those independent voices involved in this process for their diligence in keeping us accountable. This report is a tally collection of data and information, and it gives a voice to those who often have none. We are therefore interested in listening to the data and findings of different society and in the current state of affairs, the national and local level. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, the civil society voices remind us of the important role that the CNE plays in influencing national and local drug policies, and in the need to reach a balanced and rights-based commitments and engagement on the international level in order to preserve the health and welfare of humankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and also for Switzerland's important leadership here in Vienna on human rights and on harm reduction, and for your continued support of the society. So one of the blind spots in the shadow report relates to the lack of meaningful discussion on the legal regulation of internationally controlled substance surgery, when this is an increasing discussion and a reality in some parts of the world. And also, as, for example, with cannabis, as legal regulation starts to happen, we need to think about the role of corporations and how to avoid corporate capture of the markets, and also the implications of legal regulation for the global drug control regime. So to address some of these questions, I'm delighted to introduce Lisa Sanchez. Lisa Sanchez is the Executive Director of Mexico United Against Crime. Lisa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everybody. As Anne said, my name is Lisa Sanchez. I'm the Executive Director of a Mexican NGO called Mexico United Against Crime. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, and I excuse myself in advance because I will need to leave early, as I will need to start my journey back to Mexico in the next couple of hours. Before I start, let me please take a moment to express our solidarity with the Palestinian people as they face an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. As civil society representatives committed to human rights, several of us would like to urge member states present here in Vienna to uphold international law and prevent further bloodshed and destruction through very concrete actions. Some of those actions include an immediate permanent ceasefire, the effective delivering of humanitarian aid, the end of occupation of Palestinian territories, the cessation of arms transfer, the release of those arbitrarily detained on all sides, and a credible commitment towards peace and justice. Now, back to the topic of our event. let me start by saying that for decades, Mexico has suffered the most extreme negative impacts of prohibition and punitive drug policies. Violence, conflict, human rights violations, criminalization, prison overcrowding, and further exclusion of marginalized populations are just some of these particular impacts, and most of them, let me say, are actually more related to prohibition than to drugs themselves. Prohibition created illicit markets and empowered criminal actors, and due to the nature of those problems, it became clear to us that we needed to reform our drug policies and that it was also imperative to adapt the international drug control regime to make it more fit for purpose. To achieve these goals, civil society in Mexico has advocated for change and has pushed for the adoption of alternative approaches that include harm reduction, effective decriminalization, and legal regulation of different substances, starting with cannabis. Civil society has also advocated for the recognition of the current tensions within the international drug control regime and between the drug conventions and national legislations in many countries around the world. Working towards these goals, civil society in Mexico has been somewhat successful in advancing the cause. We actually managed to take prohibition to court, and we won. Specifically, in the case of cannabis regulation, we participated in an unprecedented effort of strategic litigation that took a series of cases to the Supreme Court in Mexico and argued there that prohibitionist drug laws violated the right to health of those patients who needed access to medical cannabis, as well as the right to privacy for those adults who wanted to grow and use cannabis without recurring to the illegal market. As a result, the court reached a number of rulings in which it declared the administrative prohibition of cannabis unconstitutional. Such win led to a very complicated yet unfinished process of legislative change that in the case of medical cannabis translated into a law that was enacted in 2017 that allowed for the medical and scientific use of cannabis derivatives. Although this was an important step in the right direction, this law failed to address the problem that it was intended to solve. The resulting regulation prioritized profit over the rights of patients and continued to exclude farmers and continued to criminalize users. In the case of the regulation of cannabis adult use, the incapability of our Congress to approve a law resulted in a very bizarre regime in which those individuals who can get access to a government permit to grow and use cannabis are now allowed to do so, whilst the rest of the population is not. Lessons learned from these processes show that we need to have broader and more profound discussions within national governments and among governments and other stakeholders, including civil society, to define what are the public problems that we have and that we need to solve in our countries, and how alternative drug policies and approaches can contribute to do so. They also show us that we need to be very aware of the negative influence the strong lobby from foreign companies can have over legislation and over the resulting legal regimes. In Mexico, such lobby managed to exclude farmers and communities from the medicinal industry and tried to create important entry barriers for local actors wanting to participate in the eventual adult use market. We still don't have a law, so that's why it's a potential. Lessons learned also show how important and urgent it is to have comprehensive guidelines at the international level that can help governments design balanced and more effective policies that can actually deliver results on the human rights, social justice, and public health front. Reducing the space for discretion is key. Otherwise, such discretion and uncertainty will continue to fuel corruption and will continue to allow for corporate capture. In some places, transnational companies seem more ready than governments to seize the opportunities created by the regime crisis and to take advantage of the need for change. We need to correct this situation and be better prepared to defend our cause because we cannot afford to fail again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you for being with us, because I know you now have to basically run to catch a plane back to Mexico. But really those important insights and reflections on, of course, how legal legislation has played out in Mexico, I think was such important learning for us of that trajectory, things to continue to move forward. So thank you. Thank you for the recommendations of the report. You're very welcome. So moving on, another key blind spot that we had identified in discussion at the CND has been how to address the colonial legacy of the current drug control regime and the need to urgently redress the disproportionate impact of punitive drug control on specific ethnic groups. So to speak to that point, I'm delighted to welcome Gilbert Taurua, representative of the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance. Gilbert, you have the floor.
Kia ora. Ai rere ko mai te awa nui, mai te kāui maunga ki te ngaro ko au te awa ko au te e mauri ora. An old Māori proverb, a whakatauki from my mother's people, from the river, or from the mountain to the sea, I am the river, and the river is me. Thank you to the International Drug Policy Consortium for this opportunity, the inclusion of the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance in this such important event. We acknowledge the support of the Open Society Foundation that has enabled our Indigenous voice to be heard at this year's UN C&D. See if this works. The International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance was launched in 2018 at the Healing Our Spirit Worldwide Gathering in Sydney. The Alliance is a partnership between the Aboriginal Drug and Alcohol Council of South Australia, Te Whare Tukutuku of Aotearoa, inclusive of Tira Ora and the New Zealand Drug Foundation, and the Thunderbird Foundation of Canada. As a member of the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance, I personally have advocated with the IDPC for at least the last 10 years for the need to ensure an Indigenous voice in international drug policy development. Indigenous people are distinct social cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to lands and natural resources where they live, occupy or have been displaced. Indigenous people are inheritors of their unique culture and ways of relating to people in their environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic and political characteristics that are distinct from those from the dominant societies in which they live. And despite their cultural differences, Indigenous people from around the world share common problems related to the protection of their human rights. I acknowledge the role of IDPC in the production of the off-track shadow report for the midterm review of the 2019 Ministerial drugs. And the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance believes the shadow report highlights some important Indigenous drug policy issues and has been endorsed obviously by 51 civil societies and an expert advisory committee. It would be our preference that Indigenous human rights are further amplified, and my observations on the shadow report are as follows. Protecting the health of people who use drugs. The shadow report struggles to recognise the disproportionate health burden on Indigenous people, our late presentations and in turn poor health outcomes. It fails to recognise that health systems are not always responsive to Indigenous communities, in part perpetrated by racism and unconscious bias. We were informed this week by Professor James Ward from the University of Queensland that there's now evidence that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia are contracting hepatitis C more than 7 times, even after being treated with antiviral medications. Reducing the overuse of prisons and punishment. The shadow report struggles to recognise the over-incarceration of Indigenous people worldwide. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'm from, Māori make up 17% of the total population, yet make up 53% men and 67% of women make up our prison populations, which is often streaming from minor drug offending. Addressing organised crime, violence and insecurity. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, some organised crimes are facilitated through Indigenous Māori gangs, such as the Mongrel Mob, Manakaha and the Black Power. These groups formed in the 1960s and 70s and were a direct result of colonisation and the urban drift from traditional lands and ways of living. Solutions in reducing drug harm in these communities requires innovation and unique approaches versus always being hard on crime, and the need to work with these gangs to find their own solutions. Reforming drug policies that violate human rights. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, sets out the individual and collective rights of Indigenous people, rights of culture, identity, language, employment, health, education, and other issues. The Shadow Report could strengthen the inclusion of UNDRIP, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the right to self-determination, and the requirement of member states to consult with their Indigenous populations. Improving data collection and analysis, data governance and data sovereignty from an Indigenous perspective is now recognised as an acceptable best practice. The collection of data and its analysis requires affirmative action inclusive of Indigenous people. I congratulate the IDPC on the Off-Track Shadow Report. The International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance looks forward to contributing to policy solutions into the future. In pre-colonisation times, Indigenous people controlled their own destiny, had access to their own psychotropic worlds, and were the first harm reductionists. Colonisation was founded on the trade of drugs and alcohol to seize lands and dispossess our people. Blanket approaches like the war on drugs has particularly impacted on Indigenous people. Police-targeted racial profiling has resulted in more hazardous behaviour, incarceration, and higher rates of HIV, Hep C, and early death. Healing from addiction for Indigenous people is rooted in a cultural intervention, which addresses wellness in a holistic approach in contrast to Western biomedical models. The disproportionate impact of current drug laws, policies, and practice is influenced within the context of personal and institutional racism, which is consistent across all Indigenous communities. The war on drugs has never been a war on the root cause of drug use. It's always been a war on the people using drugs through increased policing, prosecution, and incarceration. It fails to recognise why people use drugs and the complex web of social factors that contribute to drug use. Similar to Nothing About Us Without Us, the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance strongly advocates for the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous people in the design and the development of future drug policy. For those that are interested, I have to give this a plug. We are hosting a side event for anyone that has interest in this particular subject, 2:10 tomorrow to M7, moving towards drug policy that improves wellbeing and aligns with Indigenous knowledge and practice. Nō reira, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Heaven.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gilbert. And we really welcome the International Indigenous Peoples Drug Policy Alliance. Sorry, it's a lot of words. I'm delighted that you're here in force. Maybe if I could just add one thing, for a long time, I really think that one of the biggest conflicts between the international drug control regime and the drug treaties and the international human rights regimes and conventions has been on Indigenous rights. And it has been around the prohibition of the chewing of the coca leaves. And so the WHO this year will, after the request from the government of Bolivia, will actually conduct a critical review of the coca leaf. And it's something that I think together with many colleagues in this room will be following very closely to see if there's going to be that change to redress that very racist and colonial imposition on the rights of the people of the Andes. So thank you very much, Gilbert, for being with us. So the third blind spot of the Shadow Report is the ongoing lack of recognition, formally political recognition, I should say, of harm reduction here at the CND, and how this really sits in sharp contrast with the positions of both other UN entities within the system, such as UNAIDS, but also in other UN policy-making forums. The term harm reduction was used as early as 2001 in the General Assembly in the first declaration on HIV/AIDS. So it continues to be a controversial term here in Vienna. Of course, like many of you, were following the progress of the US resolution L5 quite closely, which of course was tabled with the term harm reduction included, and we very much hope that the final result will include the term. But in the meantime, I'm delighted to introduce Emily Christie, who's the Senior Advisor on Human Rights and the Law from UNAIDS, to speak to this point around leadership on harm reduction. Emily, you have to.
Thanks very much, and hi everybody. Thank you for the invitation to join you all today. And I'd like to start by thanking IDPC for a great report. It's really useful, particularly having a few recommendations, also female weights in there really helps me with my job. It's been 5 years since governments expressed concern on the high rates of HIV and hepatitis among people who use drugs, and committed to take initiatives and measures aimed at minimizing the adverse public health and social consequences of drug abuse. In 2021, the UN General Assembly also adopted new targets relating to HIV, and we had the new Global AIDS Strategy adopted as well. And this had specific targets on harm reduction. But when we look at harm reduction in those targets, it's not just the provision of harm reduction services that are the targets, but also their uptake. So both are measured, both the provision of and access to. And then there's targets specific to the barriers that prevent that provision and access. So there's targets around stigma, discrimination, criminalization, and violence, and harmful gender norms. Of course, harm reduction is so much broader than this. So talking about social support, legal support, and so on. And of course, one of the, in my mind, best UN documents to look at all these sort of different aspects around harm reduction is the WHO Consolidated Guidelines on Key Populations that came out in 2022. Unfortunately, as noted in IDPC's report, the world is not on track to meet the targets that were adopted in 2012. Harm reduction services are still not available to many, and where they are available, criminal laws still render them inaccessible. I'm not going to go into all the data that we have around the targets, but if you are interested, I know this is a launch of your report. It's very small. It's only 8 pages. Most of it is like little tables. There's a few up the back, actually under your laptop near the glasses, and the rest are online. We've pulled together all the targets and data that are relevant to people who inject drugs. But just some of the highlights. So we know that there's been a slight increase in the number of countries reporting that they have harm reduction services, but in the last 5 years, actual coverage and access remains limited. So since 2018, only 3 countries reported achieving the recommended target of 50% of opioid users accessing opioid agonist maintenance therapy, and only 5 reported achieving the target of 200 needles and syringes per person. In 2019, we actually reported that less than 1% of people who injected drugs lived in countries that reported recommended coverage of both needles and syringes and opioid agonist maintenance therapy. And since then, no other country has reported reaching that target. So while we have quite a number of countries with programs, the coverage really isn't there. The funding, as we know, is far below that which is required. Data that is reported to UNAIDS, about 45 countries reporting to us. Of those 45 countries, their actual spending only amounts to 7% of the resource needs for those countries. And even for that, about 70% of those funds came from international sources. Even if we did achieve all our objectives and targets around the provision of harm reduction services, we know that the punitive laws and stigma and discrimination are still very, very high and preventing access. So in 2023, 8 of the 14 countries reporting data had more than 10% of people who inject drugs avoiding accessing healthcare services because of that stigma and discrimination. We know at least 145 countries still criminalize use or possession of small amounts of drugs, and of those that don't criminalize, there are still administrative fines and barriers in many countries. And we know that people who use drugs are the least likely of any key population to be represented in development policies on the making of development and making of policies that affect them. It's been a long week already. What all of this leads to is a situation where HIV prevalence is 7 times higher amongst people who inject drugs than the rest of the population. In some countries, it's more than 50% of people who inject drugs are living with HIV, but in other countries, it's 0. And that's the most heartbreaking thing, to have that range, to know that it's possible to get it down to close to 0, and so many countries still aren't able to get that far. It does demonstrate that harm reduction approaches do work, and it is possible. But we do need to scale up the implementation of harm reduction and law reform. And we do need to do that under the leadership of well-funded organizations led by people who use drugs. And to achieve it, of course, we need coordinated action among government, civil community-led organizations, UN agencies, and other stakeholders. And I was asked to talk about, a little bit of what we can do at CND. And we were really happy to see how many delegations at the high-level segment included ministries of health last week. I'm not a veteran, so I can't say if it's a record, but there were a lot, and it was great to see. And we hope that this can continue to make sure that those discussions and the experts and the people who are looking after ministries of health and departments are actually here and part of the discussion. I think is incredibly important. I was also at a number of side events this week that talked about decriminalization, alternatives to incarceration. We need more of this. UNAIDS will continue coming here. We will be continuing to talk about this and bringing the experiences we have. And we look forward to working with others around this here at in plenary. And also the stronger connection as well. The House didn't stop. Having the High Commissioner here was fantastic. And also the head of the UN General Assembly, got the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as well. And, strengthening those connections, making sure that that continues, that we also have CED going elsewhere, and everybody really sort of bringing all of those different multi-sectoral aspects to CID is really critical. There's a famous John Muir quote, which is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Multilateralism is really important, and what we do here is incredibly important, but it only works if we link it to multi-sectorialism. Thank you so much, Emily. And yes, I think you highlighted the engagement of other UN entities here in Vienna has really been critical in opening up the discussion here on the need to reform, on human rights, particularly UNAIDS work to address the human rights of people who use drugs, and now increasingly to really, open up a sensible discussion of decriminalization. So thank you so much. So on to our final speaker. One of the final blind spots of the Shadow Report is how to address human rights abuses associated with the use of new technologies and highly punitive drug control. And I'm delighted to introduce Johann Panki Nadela, who's the Executive Director of IDUCare in the Philippines. And Panki, we're going to speak to this.
Thank you. Thank you, IDPC. Welcome.
We just speak up a little.
Thank you very much. It's good. So next. So let me start with a true and tragic experience of a woman who used drugs here in the Philippines. That was a victim of barangay watch list under Tokan. So barangay is a local government unit, the smallest local government unit in the Philippines. Then the watch list is where you have this name under the barangay personality name, so that they will be under community-based rehab or in the name list of the drug users. So, and the Tokan is the name of the Tokan operation of the police. So this is the story of Chris. We had two kids staying with a family members. Who is her 30s. She was illegally arrested in her house without a warrant, and her arresting officer wasn't wearing a uniform. The officer beat her up severely that she had bruises and black eyes, and her face swollen because of that. She was detained in hidden place in a police station, and her relatives didn't know where she was detained. It was as if she was missing. She was secretly detained for a week to let the bruises in her face heal. Still in pain from the police beating, Chris was also sexually abused and raped while in detention. After a week, charges were filed accusing her of a drug use and selling. For selling, there is no bail and potential means life imprisonment, even decided by the judge. So this is why experience he was, of all his experience, still go to jail. So the problem with the barangay watch list is that were forced to surrender and enroll in a community-based rehab program, which is you cannot withdraw form from. Everybody can send names to the watch list that can be abused to personal gain or revenge, resulting to overcrowded in a way. It's resulted to overcrowded in prison. Then there's this plea bargaining policy to decrease prison population. However, more arrests than decrease than release. Then you are arrested or under community-based rehab program. There's no withdrawal management. Relapsing is considered as a crime. You're subject to a police operation. The sentence for possession in this case is up to 10 to 12 years maximum. Just being a drug user. Since the justice system is slow in the Philippines, the only option is to plea bargain to have shorter sentence, resulting the cause of hindrance in the future in finding job due to having a criminal records. Random testing is requirement. This is later cause stigma as criminal and violation. If violation for plea bargaining condition result to rearrest if you are drug testing and turn out positive, so you are subject for a police subject, and hopefully they will be arresting. Then this police planting evidence, the most common and easy practice of arrest since proving innocent is difficult. Although it's stated in the Philippine drug law that planting evidence is illegal and punishable, this process is mostly done by law enforcement as abuse of power to make money and get promotion. This can even justify the killing of people who use drugs. If not put out and or corrected, planting evidence will become a normalized and entrenched. So the call of action is that we call for drug policies that do not treat as criminals, suspects, surrenderees, surrenderers, and menace to a society. Salamat and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And yeah, it's very painful to hear case stories of things that are happening on the ground in the Philippines. Then thank you for sharing them with us and bringing the reality to bear on the situation that we have during, this discussion that we have here in Vienna, because sometimes I think with the negotiations and, in those rooms where member state representatives are there, the humanity is forgotten in this situation. If people's lives and what's really happening on the ground is forgotten. So thank you. It's really important to have that. So this has never happened before in a side event that I've attended at any CMD, but we have almost 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So I really welcome your comments, questions, reflections from the floor. We'll have plenty of time. So please do raise your hand. Don't be shy. There must be. I did have a question for Panki, but I also see that we have Ines here from Nobot, Philippines. Maybe Ines, you would also respond. But listening to this situation, we know that, Philippines has been experiencing a very draconian war on drugs, essentially, since 2016. And perhaps, if you're able to share with us any recommendations of what we can do as the international community, what other actions can we take to support you in what is happening in the Philippines? That would be my question I would ask. Yes, sir.
If there's next. I was Albert Anel from the Philippines, now working in Rome. Now, I really appreciate the paradigm shift from punitive to approach to health approach. Now, while we are talking about the shift, I think even if we are successful, some sentences, some legal decisions have been made and are being made, putting people in jail. And one of them, of course, is live at the day market. So suppose we have changed the paradigm, but we have not changed the sentence. What do we do with this? I heard something, a lesson from death penalty chains, etc. Maybe other ideas can be offered.
Thank you. Ines, I didn't want to put you in the spot, but I don't know if you have any.
Just one side of that. Like my nephew, less than 40 years old, has been given 2 double life sentences. He is now in the National Penitentiary for a few grams.
Yeah. Thank you. Kitty?
Yes, I have been sense of question because this is my Shitty from Thailand. First time here, very overwhelmed. But how do we kind of get the regulators responsible for the things that they are doing? How do we hold them responsible? Because it's like upstairs is different, downstairs is different. We're kind of talking in the same thing, but not really seeing eye to eye. And it seems like I'm here and I can't even address any of my country's leaders about that issue that we have. But or even if we can, when we go back home, nothing showed us. So like it seems like, and they are waiting for the rulings or the the decision making of the people that are here. So it's kind of like how do we make them responsible for the things that they are doing?
Yeah. Would anyone in the panel like to do it?
I'm so sorry.
Very pertinent and straightforward question. I mean, this is also my first C&D. Also overwhelmed. My space is much more in the Human Rights Council and other spaces, and I think we have to remember that this is not the only space where we can, I say we, I'm the UN, where civil society can hold governments accountable. Sorry, it's hard to break that habit of coming from that space before, but all of the discussions that we have here around drug policy, around health, around human rights, also relate to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also relate to the Human Rights Committee and others. And so making sure that those mechanisms are being used and that also those treaty bodies and experts are aware of what is being discussed here and of the obligations, I think is really critical, and trying to make sure that we're using all of those different spaces and not just this one. Sorry, I'm answering that very much as a human rights lawyer rather than as a UNAIDS person.
I have the question. I came just Monday, not during the week, but I was very lucky because on the computer was even better than in plenary to follow the whole procedures. There was a very interesting thing just before leaving that there was a fight. I didn't understand why. Some countries, maybe I can name them, but it doesn't matter much. They were arguing that these fields of drugs is not appropriate because the human rights belong to one section and the other one. And then came the famous discourse of Volker Türk. So I was very suspicious because it was kind of a bit, very diplomatic. But why shouldn't we talk? I was wondering why these people pretend not to talk about human rights, to be kind of separate the schizophrenic. One is human rights, one is drug. So just was raising the argument.
It's a great question. I don't want to abuse my position as moderator, so the ambassador or any of the panelists who might want to respond to that, because why should we be so siloed? Why is this constantly coming up, even now in 2024, when we actually got the High Commissioner for Human Rights to come in person to Vienna to address the CND? Why is there still this discussion that things must be kept separate? Ambassadors?
Well, I don't know. I ask myself the same question. Why should we not discuss all elements? Because if we want to address drug problems, and of course, human rights is part of our answer. It's part of our guiding principles of how we address drug issues. It serves really as a guidance to us. That is the case in many countries, but not in all countries. And here in Vienna, yes, we have the pleasure of 190 countries meeting, and you have different views, obviously. So I'll ask those that are against including it, why they are against. I cannot answer. To your comment from Thailand, I mean, how can you hold the regulators accountable? Drug politics are implemented by national governments. What we do here in Vienna, we coordinate on a global level between countries, but the implementation always lays with governments. If a government decides to shoot against its own people, like it has with unfortunately in some countries, that in the war of drugs, it's their responsibility. It's not UN's responsibility. It's the government that's responsible. Same to Thailand. So, only if your own government's responsible through actions, for whatever you have at your disposal. And I know it's easy to talk here. It's more difficult to implement if that's all.
They also call upon like the UNODC, like, oh no, this is what the UN say that we have to do. So it's kind of like a throwing the buck around constantly.
Definitely that's the case. That's the case. On the other hand, other governments interpret the same UNODC decisions differently than your government does. Yeah. So I mean, there is some diversity in how to interpret. And at the end of the day, the implementation is competence of the national government. So that's where you have to address properly. So there is no shortcut from multilateral diplomacy to implementation in the field. That's not going to happen. Sorry if I'm not making anybody happy in this room. But
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, Keith.
I was just fortunate to cross over to the Czech Republic last weekend and had some time with I guess the government representatives. They were making statements quite clearly that prohibition is criminal. Prohibition harms people. They now have the evidence to clearly demonstrate that the approaches previously have not worked. And so I appreciate it must be difficult in your country, but I think the more that we can quantify and qualify the harms that prohibition does to our people, the sooner where maybe we can get some move happening.
I'm just going to go back to mine since it's tough. But the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva is a situation where countries comment on other countries' human rights record, and that includes, their drug policy. And so it is a situation where you can have, a few other countries asking questions of your country's government about what they're doing on drug policy and human rights and the right to health or the right to alternative development, right to a healthy environment. It comes under so many different ones, and then making recommendations which the government can accept on. And it's a different form of accountability tool that we can use. It doesn't exist in this space, and this space may say that, we can't talk about elsewhere, but the Universal Periodic Review doesn't have that view. Perfectly happy to talk about drug policy there. That there's not. It's this concept of siloing is something that is said here, but the UN General Assembly has resolutions on drug policy, and your Human Rights Council has resolutions on drug policy. So they're not seeing it as a siloed thing. It's just here that there's this insistence on maintaining this.
Any final questions or comments?
I have one
Please.
prohibition. In a world post-prohibition, what will be the role of the IDPC and other organizations and work? Obviously,
We'll go work on climate change. Yeah, bring on that world. I'm ready. We are trying to make ourselves irrelevant. That's what we're doing here.
So what would be your first step here? Because we're moving towards, not really everyone's moving towards the space, but this idea of prohibition and post-prohibition as an organization on drug policy, what would be the first part that you would play in a prohibition world? Like, if it's not policy, you still have things to contribute. What would you transition into?
What would we transition into? I think there's still a lot of work to be done to end prohibition, but I like your optimism. Yeah. Very much so. Honestly, what the next frontier that we're already starting to battle, which I think Lisa touched on in her presentation, and it's a shame she's not here to talk about, is now to have a socially just, legally regulated market, right? Like a just transition. When we talk about a just transition, when we talk about, climate, like transitioning people who work in currently like
the fossil fuel industry, et cetera, into more green economies, how do we therefore implement a just transition for farmers who currently grow coca, opium, cannabis illegally into a legal market? I mean, the problem with the discussion, the way that it's going at the moment, is that it's as though the market doesn't exist and we have to build it from ground zero. But there's an existing market, and we need to transition that market into the legal sphere rather than just create a new market that's run by corporations, that completely excludes all the traditional actors. That's huge work that we all have to do now in a post-prohibition world that's starting to emerge, because the fear of corporate capture, it's real and it's happening, and it will not be socially just. It will be, be very problematic because it will not meet the goals of what we're currently fighting for in terms of social justice and human rights in drug piracy. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And see, I'm totally abusing my position as moderator. And just in the last minute, maybe to say to you, I think I just want to, be very clear, since the IDPC has been engaging at the CND, we hear that every year, all the time. This is not the place to discuss human rights. That's for Geneva. That's for Geneva. And we have said, as diplomatically as we can, that we fundamentally don't agree. We have gone to Geneva. We have engaged the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. We have engaged other human rights mechanisms, made it clear to them that it's within their mandate to engage in drug policy, and encourage them to come here to Vienna and also make that clear. So, and I think with Volker Turk coming last week, we're really, putting pressure on the system here to accept that human rights has to be front and center of drug policy. So, they can say that, but they're not winning that argument.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zaga. Listen, thank you so much to my panelists. It's been great to have you. Thank you to all of you for being in the room and engaging in this discussion. There should be shadow reports at the back. If not, are there. And they're online. There's also some at the NGO table. But please do keep in touch with IDPC, and have a great rest of your CND. Thank you.